There you go. All right. So what's new in avian taxonomy? We're going to approach this webinar in 3 parts. We'll start with a little introduction, and then each panelist will have about 15 minutes for their presentations. Pam is going to give us a brief taxonomic summary with regional examples. Marshall is going to discuss the effects on our eBird checklist and discuss a bit about the red-rumped swallow and some other topics. And Shawn is going to talk about changes in bird orders, families, and genera. And essentially, we'll just kind of have a little discussion among the team at the end and discuss some notable hybrid cases or other notes. And then we'll have an opportunity at the end to have an audience discussion. So let's get started. All right. So if you would all bring your cameras on for a second. That's great. Thank you. So we have a lot of interest in our efforts to work towards this common taxonomy, this global taxonomy. And there were 2 questions. One user asked, what is the update on the global consolidation efforts of the world taxonomies? And another is like, looking forward to hearing progress and reconciling differences shown in birds of the world, eBird, Clements, and Merlin. And how does this relate to the IOC and the HBW bird life taxonomies? So maybe Marshall, would you be willing to take that?
Yep, I'm gonna show a couple slides to help explain it. Hopefully that's shown up with the red-rumped swallow from Birds of the World. So there were sort of 2 questions there. The first one is about differences in the Birds of the World, eBird, Merlin, all about birds taxonomy. And that's the easy one. There are no differences. As soon as the taxonomy rolls out, we, on October 22nd this year, all of those platforms switched over to use our 2024 taxonomy. So we try to coordinate that really perfectly so that literally like in the morning of the 22nd of October this year, everything switched over. So that was Birds of the World, all about birds, eBird. The science products that we use in eBird are also sort of an outgrowth of that. So the names switch over there. And arguably the most important is Merlin, just because it engages so many people. There are millions of Merlin users. We really see it as the pathway to engaging new people in the wonder of birds around the world. Merlin also is flipping over in very short sequence after the taxonomic update. So we endeavor to keep everything that comes out of the Cornell lab totally aligned on taxonomy and nomenclature.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to just give a real quick primer on, sometimes we talk about the Clements taxonomy and the eBird taxonomy. Clements is what Pam's going to be talking about the real formal taxonomic backbone, species limits, correct nomenclature, applying different genera to different species. Shawn's going to talk some about the sequence and how the higher level taxonomy of orders and families govern some of that. So that's really Clements, and it sets the backbone that are species and subspecies known in the world. eBird uses that as the backbone for all the data that we collect, but we also have sort of these extra categories that make it useful to use in the field. And that is when you go out in the field and you see a distant swallow, you can call it a swallow spa, or you can say, I'm in a contact zone between 2 formerly lumped types of red-rumped swallows. So I'm going to use a slash for either European or Eastern red-rumped swallow. That also lets us do hybrids and undescribed species. And then we also have, as Laura sort of started, the common names reflected in lots and lots of different languages around the world. So there are over 100 different choices that birders can use. So that's all great for sort of Cornell Lab, but we also have all these other groups involved with studying birds and organizing bird data around the world. They may not use the same taxonomy, and we've existed for decades in this space where different groups would be using different taxonomies, and one group's version of Larus argentatus herring gull might be totally different from another group's, totally different from another group's, totally different from another group's. And that's made it really difficult to plug data together, especially as we've gotten more digital. So Avalist, which, as we said before, formerly the working group avian checklist of the IOU, now sort of rebranded as Avalist, is this effort to really bring all these different groups together. So the IOC World Bird List, eBird Clements, BirdLife, AOS, North American Classification Committee, and South American Classification Committee, and other sort of taxonomists around the world have been collaborating for the past 5 years now to review every species level difference between those checklists, try to come to an agreement on them. That often surfaces a lot of new information that Pam is going to be talking about. And we're really excited to say now that 2025 is going to be the year of release for that. And as that happens, basically the Cornell eBird Clements taxonomy is going to slide right into use Avalist going forward. We expect the same from the IOC World Bird List, and BirdLife International is also sort of taking steps for a more gradual shift over to follow Avalist. So the real hope is that we'll have a lot more consistency of avian taxonomy around the world. So it's an exciting time for that right now.
Yeah, it's really going to simplify things and the way global ornithology works, and our ability to kind of go between one resource to another with understanding what the bird names are. So just today, it's interesting. I heard somebody asked again about gray heron versus gray heron, right? So I just think it's worth repeating a lot how that people can change their common name to the language that suits them, so they can search on, for example, gray versus gray. So can you explain that real quick?
Sure. Let me jump to those slides real quick.
It's a setting in both birds of the world. It's a setting in eBird that will affect whether you're seeing it in birds of the world and in eBird and in Merlin.
Yeah, so this is getting to the over 100 name sets. So Hirundo rustica, barn swallow in English has all these different names. This is over 70 different name options for people all around the world. Whatever language you speak, there's a good chance that we have the translation for barn swallow that's familiar to you. The result in birds of the world, if we switch to black-bellied plover, if you're from the UK and you have always known this bird is gray plover and you love birds of the world, but the one thing you hate is that it forces black-bellied plover down your throat when you really prefer gray plover, you can actually make that switch. And the same is true if you speak Arabic at the top, Spanish in the middle, or Thai on the bottom there. It's also worth just making sure everyone here knows, if you do speak Spanish, now all the content of Birds of the World is available in Spanish, and Laura and the team are working towards expanding that to French and Portuguese, and in the future some other languages. So really exciting to have that become a more international resource in things beyond the bird names. So to change the bird names, this is a eBird example, but the same would apply in Birds of the World or other lab websites, Cornell lab websites. You go up to that little icon at the top right that sort of gives you a profile. Click on Preferences. That brings you to a screen where you can customize if you want to see English name, scientific name, or both. And if you pick a common name or an English name, then you get this drop-down list with all these different options. And it's too long to fit on the page, but if you speak French or Finnish or Faroese or Croatian or Czech or Danish, you can get those bird names.
Right. Thank you so much for pointing that out again. If you are not a user of eBird, but you do use Birds of the World, you still have to go. Your account will allow you to make this change on the eBird site. So just go there, make that change, and then you have an eBird Cornell account whether you use eBird or not. So
yeah, and the one quick thing to say is that the web interface and the mobile interfaces for, say, Merlin or eBird mobile, those actually do need to be set independently. So they're not automatically talking to each other about what nomenclature you might want to use. And that's partly because people sometimes want to maintain those in different ways on different devices, but you do need to set those independently.
all right. Well, thank you so much, Marshall. I'm going to move on to Pam now. And if you could just give us an overview, Pam, and tell us what the general regional differences in the summary is for the year. And we'll go. Jessica, if you could bring up Pam's talk, that would be great.
Okay, well, I'm happy to be here to give you a summary of the main changes in the 2024 update. I won't read through the numbers, but we do have three new unquote new subspecies, one of which is new to science. One was a extinct fossil species that we just added, and one was well, I'll talk about it later, but one was an unrecognized species that's been validated. So it's a very exciting find. And we end up with counting the species splits and the lumps, we end up with a net gain of 128 species globally for 11,145 species globally. We also have a lot of name changes. These are made because of taxonomic changes. It's required that we make changes when we have a split between a parent species and two daughter or more than two daughter species. We have to make some changes. And we try to find names that have been used before and are appropriate if possible. We also are trying to align with the other checklists, and that involves some name changes as well. And that's all summarized in the document that you can find online. If you go to the Clements checklist updates for the 2024 October update, you'll find all that explained in some detail. Excuse me. We also have a lot of new and changed groups and other kinds of changes that I'll summarize. Oops, I just lost my, okay, next slide. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but here's a map that shows roughly where the most changes were. If it's blue, it was fewer changes, and if it's red, it's many changes. So Indonesia takes the cake. Indonesian archipelago, I should say, not just Indonesia, but the whole archipelago takes the cake with 30 splits and 3 lumps, also one new species. New Guinea, Melanesia is not far behind with 25. And we even have some changes for the South Atlantic and Pacific Islands, et cetera. So lots of changes. And we'll go through some of them. Oops, I can do it again. Okay, next slide. But it's not just species splits, it's also a lot of changes in genera, and these are based on new information generally that like phylogenies that allow us to recognize, you know, what species are related to what and what they need to be, what genera they need to be put in. So we have a net change of 7 genera. Nomenclatural changes are things like replacement names, where the rules for scientific names mean that a different name needs to be substituted for the existing name. And the great spotted kiwi is an example of that. The name had to change because the long recognized name turned out to be based on hybrids, which are not a valid taxon. And spelling corrections, gender possessive, et cetera. So those are the kinds of things that changed because of nomenclature. So, right, next slide. And we had quite a lot of subspecies changes, a few more additions than subtractions. Subtractions can be either synonymies, meaning that the subspecies is not recognized as valid because it's too similar to another one. Deletions mean that it's deleted for another reason. There was one that turned out to be in the wrong species, even in the wrong genus, and a couple other things like that. But mostly it's synonymies and some moves from, like, a subspecies moved from one species to another based on new information. So we had a net change of almost 40 subspecies. And higher order, Shawn will be talking about those, but we had just a few of those. Next slide, please. All right, so we do again have changes globally, and this shows a few of the species that have changed and approximately the regions that they inhabit. Next slide. And the biggie for a lot of people is the herring gull, one that a lot of people had already recognized before as a 2, 3, or 4-way split. We ended up with a 4-way split, and 2 of those are in Europe and North America. And these really had to be split because it turns out they're not each other's closest relatives. it should be said that based on this phylogeny by Czerny and Natali and many others who have also shown a similar result, that the relationships of the large gulls are very, very difficult to resolve because they're all very closely related and they hybridize a lot, at least many of them hybridize. And so it's not like they're super distantly related or anything, but there's no evidence that they're each other's closest relatives. In addition, their vocalizations are surprisingly different. And there's evidence that at least from one study that one of them doesn't respond to the vocalizations of the other, and their juvenile plumages are different as well. So we now have those two species, plus the next slide, please. In addition, we have two species in Asia, one of which the Vega gull gets into Alaska regularly as well. Vega gull is an Arctic breeder in Arctic Russia, and also a little bit in far western Alaska, and migrates along the coast mainly, and is a very coastal bird. And its juvenile plumage is somewhat different from the other herring gulls as well. Its vocalizations, however, are not particularly distinctive. They're kind of intermediate between European and American. There has not been a published formal analysis of vocalizations, but hopefully somebody will do one at some point. Mongolian gull, on the other hand, has quite different vocalizations. And in addition to the fact that it's not closely related, according to this phylogeny and others, it really doesn't have any business being considered conspecific with the Vega gull. It might possibly be conspecific with another species, the Larus cachinens. Next slide, please. All right, moving to Madagascar, we have a split that had been recognized by BirdLife for some time of the olive-capped kua from the red-capped kua. Olive-capped is the southwestern form, red-capped northwestern. There might be there's some publications that state there are intermediates, hybrids, et cetera, but we haven't been able to find evidence for that. And it seems that they're not even approaching each other geographically. But further study is certainly needed. There's also evidence that their vocalizations, which are somewhat variable and not very well documented, there's also evidence that they do differ, as you can see from the sonograms below. All right, next slide, please. Okay, another long-awaited one. The most cosmopolitan bird species has now been split into three. This is not the end of the story for barn owl. There are numerous additional problems, especially among island taxa, some of them extinct. And yet this is pretty much mandated by several studies that show, I apologize for the not very great nature of my drawing, but anyway, it at least shows you what goes with what. So, so the Javanica clade, the eastern one, is found exclusively in Asia and Australasia, including the Western Pacific. And it's not that closely related to the other clade, which includes the Western and American. And those two form very distinct clades from each other as well. But the clincher is that the American gives a vocalization that is quite unlike any given by Western or Eastern. It's sort of chirruping vocalization. They all give a screech, but and the screech is somewhat variable and not very helpful, but the chirruping of the American is the clincher there. Next slide, please. All right. So in Africa, moving to Africa now, one of the common, widespread, familiar birds that you hear all the time when you're in Africa is the red-fronted barbet. Well, it turns out it's not one, but two taxa, because this phylogeny by Kerschel et al. Shows that they're not that closely related. And they did an integrative taxonomic analysis that showed, even though they both go tink, tink, basically all the time, very monotonously, hence the name, there are some differences in the vocalizations that are at least consistent with their being separate species at the level of other tinkerbird vocalizations as well. They're all pretty similar, or at least many of them are pretty similar. And in size and shape, they do differ as well. That purple ellipse on the right is the southern, and the others are northern. Next slide, please. This is the biggie. I already said that about herring gull, but this one takes the cake because it was the world's most polytypic bird for a while there. The island thrush, I would say everyone pretty much knew that it needed to be split, but nobody could figure out how, because it was basically a whole bunch of taxa distributed through islands from Western Indonesia through Samoa that have completely overlapping and repeating set of plumage characters, including the very distinctive one in the center bottom from Samoa with the red head. And but then there's a whole bunch of taxa from different islands throughout the range that have the sort of robin-like, American robin-like plumage with the reddish underparts. And then the next, like the next island or the next mountain range might have a completely dark brown one. So it was intractable on the basis of morphology, but as vocalizations have been amassed, it's clear that there's multiple species involved with very different vocalizations, including, for example, in Borneo and Samoa, 2 different taxa that no one has, even though they've recorded the calls, no one has been able to record song, even though there's been quite a lot of observations of them. So some of the others, like in Fiji and Java, are excellent singers, and they sing all the time. So there's lots and lots of puzzles here, but this phylogeny by Reeve et al., which is very comprehensive, got almost all the taxa in it, is extremely useful, and one of the things that we were hoping for many years. So we really appreciate, we really think it's amazing that finally we have something to put this, to make this possible, to make this split or set of splits. And we know it's not the final word, but it's a huge improvement over the previous taxonomy. And this rather mysterious middle slide, or part of the slide, is a chart of the colors matching the phylogeny. And what you can see is that there's colors, all different blocks of colors. The left starts with the head and the right is the undertail coverts. So if you look at it more closely, you could see that there's all kinds of birds that have gray or brown heads and rufous underparts and white undertail coverts. Whereas when you get to New Guinea and Melanesia, you have a lot of taxa that are basically black or dark gray. Anyway, so again, lots of issues to be resolved there, but we know that this is a major, major improvement based on the phylogeny and the recordings that are coming in. I will say that these birds tend to be quite skulking, and many of them occur only in the mountains that are inaccessible. They're not well known, and some of them have already gone extinct, like the second from the right bottom. Well, that one might not be quite extinct, but no one has reported it for a long time. It's from New Caledonia. Next slide, please. And close on the heels of the island thrush is the common cicada bird split. And I won't go into any detail, but I think you can see from the drawing of the map that Marshall made, and I didn't have to duplicate. And the phylogeny, basically, we were able to use that phylogeny by Peterson et al. To make improvements to the taxonomy of the common cicada bird. No longer called that, because now it's split up into multiple constituent species. Again, not the last word, but a huge improvement. We knew that they couldn't be all the same species based on the phylogeny, and the vocalizations are radically different for many of them. The term cicada bird really isn't a great name for many of them that don't make any kind of a noise that sounds like a cicada, but it's a good group name otherwise. Anyway, so again, if you're in these areas, please make recordings and put them online, and it'll result in improvements. Next slide, please. All right, moving to the Caribbean, we have the 2 look-alike species of thrashers from Martinique and St. Lucia. They look alike until you start really looking close, and then there are differences like size and various, issues about color, exact coloration and darkness of the sides, etc. But they were surprisingly genetically divergent, and they also have different call notes. So quite short grading call notes in Martinique, quite long grading call notes in St. Lucia. So another split. Next slide, please. And in Fiji, we had all the various taxa of whistlers lumped. They're surprisingly variable geographically within Fiji. Fiji has a bunch of quite complicated geography that has led to that. And based on a phylogeny, they were kept separate for quite some time, the white-throated versus yellow-throated, but there's different forms of yellow-throated as well that really look quite different, but they do integrate. So it was thought that probably they should all be lumped, and that was reinforced by a phylogeny that showed that they were all related. But then it turns out that the vocalizations are super, super different, so much so that when I went to Fiji, I didn't recognize the ones on the island, the island called Kandavu, which has white-throated whistlers. They just sound absolutely different from the yellow-throated ones. And that reinforced our decision to go back to the 2-species treatment. Next slide, please. All right, I have to cut it short, but we have a lump and 2 splits in the case of the large cuckoo shrike. The Javan cuckoo shrike is now the name-bearing taxon, Coracina javensis, for the entire group that includes the Himalayan and East Asian through Javan taxa. But we have 2 other splits, Indian and Malayan, based on vocalizations as well as some genetic information. And next slide, please. Okay, this one is the very exciting rediscovery. It was rediscovered quite a few years ago, but not photographed. But now and that was a single individual, and no one found it again until a year or 2 ago. Bradley Davis happened to find one and made video recording and photographs that are excellent. This is a bird that was known only from that single specimen that's shown in the on the left of the slide, the small billed one that's shown on the top and the left panel. And anyway, lots more to be said about it, but I have to pass this on to other people. Next slide, please. And again, flagging a new species to science. This one was known for a long time, but took a long time to get the description together. And the description is very, very comprehensive and clearly establishes its status as a new species based on the fact that it's not too closely related to anything else. It is relatively close to the Florist nightjar, Capromogus masai, but vocally different as well. All right, next slide. And what's next? Well, Marshall will be talking about more of this again, but we are planning an update, not taxonomic, but range statements and a few other things. So if you have if you find a problem with the with the taxonomy or the range, let us know and we'll incorporate them as soon as we can. But we cannot make new taxonomic changes in Clements until the next update next year. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, Pam. I think Marshall's going to give his talk now.
Okay, I had to turn my video off real quick because I had a Carolina wren fly inside my house. I had to help it outside. Anyway, instead of Carolina wrens, so one of the big challenges, you know, when over 200 taxa are changed in all the ways that Pam was outlining, we have all this eBird data and Macaulay library data with sounds and recordings and videos that are all sitting in these databases. eBird's now a 2 billion record large database almost. So making the changes to all those records is a huge lift. But sometimes it's really as simple as drawing lines on a map and parsing those records out into their different constituent species. So here was an easy one. The rusty-cheeked scimitar babbler was the red-eyed scimitar babbler, which is the one in Myanmar and Thailand, was split off from that. You can see they look quite different. They're vocally different. This was an interesting one because it had probably been missed in part because of all the work with specimens, whereas all the images and sound recordings showed that the eye color is different and that they're vocally different. So, but anyway, dividing up the records fairly simple in that case. For something like red rump swallow, which was a fairly drastic reorganization. Basically what happened was striated swallow was lumped into the more widespread red rump swallow, and then that new red rump swallow was subdivided into different species. But they have pretty distinct ranges. So this blue outline is European red rump swallow, which is Cecropus rufula. The old striated swallow and sort of the migratory East Asian populations were split out as Cecropus dorica, which was the original name for red rump swallow. And then African red rump swallow, basically in sub-Saharan Africa, was split out too. But in this case, it's not so simple to just draw these lines and split up the records. You can see some of these lines come in contact. And also the entire population of European red rump swallow winters, well, almost the entire, like a big portion of the population winters down in sub-Saharan Africa. So we end up with these contact zones where we're not really sure. So in Pakistan and northwestern India is one of those, and then basically all of sub-Saharan Africa also is. But after we sort of go through this process, we end up with these fairly neat maps that do show the range limits. European red rump swallow extending up to Kazakhstan and northwestern India. But you can see this European red rump swallow is really missing most of the winter range. And that's because we just couldn't find any reports that were carefully identified. And that gets to sort of one of those key differences of this eBird informal taxonomy. When we have European/Eastern red rump swallow as an option, all those records that we're unsure of, either because they didn't have photos or media, or and coming from an overlap zone, those end up in that slash. And then most of the records from sub-Saharan Africa are still sort of parked in this European/African red rump swallow category. Most of those are African red rumps. Those tend to be the conspicuous ones around lodges that birders visit and really quite common, but we just don't know which of those might pertain to the migratory European birds. So for now, those records are left in the slash category to be conservative and to make sure that as we start to display exactly where European red rump swallow winters, we're getting it right. Really cool thing for me is seeing just how different these birds look. They're all generally similar, but if I started with European red rump swallow, which is that center top image of the bird flying over water, these birds have bicolored rumps, sort of whitish on the lower half and orangey on the upper half. They have a complete orangey collar. They have a pretty broad orangey supercilium over the eyes, which lead to sort of rufous lores, and their underparts are sort of pale buff with really fine streaking. If we go to African red rump swallow, which are the two on the left, these are two different subspecies, which is why they look so different. But they have totally concolorous cinnamon rumps, dark lores, really highly saturated birds, and end up looking quite different. They tend to be unstreaked below. The bottom left one is one that was formerly split as West African swallow. It's subspecies Domicella. They're very white below and really richly marked with chestnut on the neck and a little bit on the flanks. And then these other three images, the two on the right and the one on the bottom middle, are all the new Eastern red rump swallow. So those birds tend also to have dark lores, be sort of super saturated, have even colored cinnamon rumps, and often are really heavily streaked below. Basically always more heavily streaked below than the European red rumps. Although the ones that come closest to them in India and Pakistan are actually the least streaked. So there's a bit of an ID challenge there, where you do really well to check the rump pattern and the nape in both African and Eastern. There's a dark line that basically connects on the nape. These splits are really exciting when we can take these records and subdivide the media and start to really learn new things about these birds and how they're moving. So that this red rump swallow split has been a really fun one to really dive in on and find these vagrant records of Eastern in the range of European and winter records of European in the range of African. And so we really look forward to eBirders continuing to elucidate these ones going forward. So another real tricky one is the Cory's shearwater and Scopoli's shearwater split. Cory's is here on the right, Scopoli's is on the left. They are super, super similar. Shawn's going to talk a little bit about this split and why we have confidence in it. In terms of field ID, really the recommendation is to look only at the underside of the 10th primary, which is the outermost primary here. It's completely dark in this Cory's, and if and when it exceeds 20% white, it can be safely identified as Scopoli's. The problem is there's a lot of overlap in the 1% to 5% to 10% to 15% white, where there has been shown to be overlap in Cory's and Scopoli's. So it's a real field ID challenge. There's some other differences, but they're really subtle. The thickness of the bill and sort of just general more slender look to Scopoli's versus Cory's, but there's overlap in that too. So that leads to a real challenge in eBird. We basically had all these records ahead of the split that had been carefully identified by people that were familiar with these, formerly subspecies, now species. And so the maps before and after the split basically look the same. And then we have a ton of records that are parked in this Cory's / Scopoli's category. The area in green is an area of the Mediterranean where basically there are tons of Scopoli's and almost no evidence of Cory's occurring. So we did convert those records on behalf of users. And the areas in yellow are areas where Cory's is basically a vagrant and people have looked carefully at them and there's no evidence yet of Scopoli's occurring there. The areas in blue are areas where there are Cory's is way more prevalent than Scopoli's, and we know that from a lot of careful ID, but we have not converted those records because it gets to be sort of an impossible problem to go from Ireland south towards Portugal and try to figure out where's the line where you would stop switching records to Cory's. So basically we've left a lot of these records as a slash. It's up to users and to go back to their records and try to identify them with care. If you have photos, that's a great way to do it. Sometimes you really know that you looked at them carefully enough. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Shawn.
Thanks, Marshall, and thanks everyone. So Pam and Marshall have just highlighted some of the many exciting changes implemented in this year's update at the species level. And while I will be talking about changes at the higher level, I am going to still talk a little bit about some more species level changes just because there were so many and there were a lot of really fun ones. And so I'm going to start off with the house wren, which was until recently considered a single very wide-ranging species breeding from southern Canada and North America all the way to Tierra del Fuego in South America, with several distinct taxa in the Lesser Antilles and the Caribbean. However, it's long been thought that the house wren actually represented multiple species, with the Caribbean taxa being particularly distinct vocally and morphologically. A series of vocal, morphological, ecological, and genetic studies has provided support for finally splitting the house wren into multiple species, with paraphily between North American and South American groups relative to the distinctive Caribbean taxa, requiring a split between the North American and South American taxa, as well as all the Caribbean taxa. So here's a little bit of a zoomed in map that shows where the division between northern house wren is in North America and southern house wren is in Central and South America, as well as little arrows pointing to all the island taxa that have now been recognized. So Here on the screen is a northern house wren. And then we can see the 6 other species of house wren that we now recognize. The Caribbean taxa, as I said, are definitely the most distinctive morphologically and vocally. And you can see from these pictures that they show quite an extent of variation in the rufous tones in the plumage, as well as how much white they have on the throat and the breast, how distinctive the supercilium is. And then some have these massive, extremely long bills compared to others. Some of the Caribbean taxa are also ecologically distinct, with some having very distinct and narrow habitat preferences compared to their mainland counterparts, which are usually common in disturbed habitats and around towns and human settlements. As Marshall mentioned, another group that has long been considered to comprise multiple species are the 2 taxa in Calanectris that were formerly considered a single species, Calanectris dimedea, or the Cory shearwater. We now treat that formally as 2 species, Cory's and Scopoles shearwater. As Marshall said, they're very similar morphologically, but they do differ in some key aspects. Marshall covered the identification aspects, but despite these morphological similarities, the 2 species differ both genetically, vocally, and ecologically. And most importantly, on islands off the coast of France, where the 2 species breed together, there are very, very, very few instances of hybridization, suggesting that there is very strong reproductive isolation between the 2. There's only a handful of known mixed pairs, and only a handful of individuals that were genetically identified as hybrids. So the vast majority, despite these 2 occurring and breeding on the same island, they show almost complete reproductive isolation. Switching gears though, to close out the species level changes, I just wanted to talk briefly about redpolls. Redpolls have long been a contentious taxonomic group, having variably been classified as between 1 to 6 species. Most recent taxonomic authorities, though, have classified redpolls as 3 species, which generally vary from the largest and palest birds being classified as hoary redpolls on the left, to the smallest and darkest birds being classified as lesser redpolls on the right, with common redpolls usually somewhat in between these 2. However, we treat them now as a single species, the redpoll, largely on the basis of genetic data that show that they are genetically nearly identical, differing mainly at a single large chromosomal inversion that codes for some plumage and bill morphology differences. This inversion has been termed a supergene, with different haplotypes or different versions of the supergene that maintain the polymorphism that we see from light to dark and small to large. The distribution of the supergene is broadly latitudinal, which also broadly follows the latitudinal climb from darker, smaller birds in the south to larger, paler birds in the north. Besides this main supergene, the 3 are genetically homogeneous and appear to show extensive gene flow. In addition, even though the versions of the supergene are associated with the different types of plumage variation in redpolls, the association is not perfect, with some individuals showing the phenotype of one redpoll but the supergene of another. The decision to lump the taxa was contentious, though, and it does really represent one of those really fuzzy taxonomic situations. In addition to the genetic evidence that redpolls are largely genetically homogeneous, much of the decision rested on rather weak evidence for assortative mating, where 2 or more forms were found breeding in the same area. While some studies did find evidence for some assortative mating, where hoary redpolls would mate with hoary redpolls and common redpolls would mate with common redpolls, some studies that did show this were based on relatively small sample sizes, and some of the patterns in assortative mating actually also appear to be variable across different locations and across different years, where in some years researchers found strong evidence for assortative mating, and in other years in the same location, weaker evidence. All right, now to the higher level taxonomic changes. So Pam alluded to this one, where we go from 1 order to 6. So the nightjars and their allies and the swifts and hummingbirds had long been shown to be closely related, but traditionally had been treated in separate orders, the Capromulgiformes and the Apodiformes. However, molecular phylogenetic studies upended this notion, finding that the owlet nightjars were actually more closely related to the swifts and hummingbirds than they were to the other nightbirds and other nightjars. And this led some taxonomic authorities, including earlier versions of the Clements checklist, to recognize an expanded Capromulgiformes that included the swifts and hummingbirds, reflecting their shared common ancestor and the shared evolutionary history. However, due to the very old age of these lineages and their morphological and ecological distinctiveness, taxonomists have preferred to continue to recognize the traditional Apodiformes as a distinct order. However, due to the rules of monophily, the other nightjars cannot simply be placed in a single order, and they must instead be divided into 5 distinct orders, with each with a single family, resulting in the Podargiformes for the frogmouths, the Nyctobiiformes for the potus, Steatronithiformes for the oilbird, and the Agotheliformes for the owlet nightjar, as well as the Capromulgiformes for the remaining nightjars in the family Capromulgidae. In the 2024 update, we also added 3 new families to the list: Onychorhynchidae, Erythrocercidae, and Salpornithidae. These 3 changes represent changes that weren't strictly necessary based on changes in our understanding of monophily, but they do represent a change in how taxonomists prefer to communicate about these groups. So Onychorhynchidae, the royal flycatchers and their allies, were traditionally historically classified with Tyrannidae, but most recently placed with Oxyrhynchidae, the enigmatic sharpbill. The yellow flycatchers in the genus Erythrocercus were most recently placed with Scutocercidae, and the spotted creepers in Salpornis were most recently classified with Certheidae. So the small radiation of flycatchers from Central and South America, the royal flycatchers, together with Myobius and Tyrannotrichus, were long thought to be part of the large radiation of flycatchers in the family Tyrannidae. Apart from the exuberant crest of the royal flycatcher, which is often concealed, you really can't find any real reasons why these species wouldn't be classified as part of Tyrannidae, as they're otherwise typical sit-and-wait predators that sally after insects from a perch, with many rictal bristles and wide flat bills typical of a flycatcher. However, in-depth studies of DNA sequence data began to paint a different picture of this group of unassuming flycatchers. So molecular phylogenetic studies found that the royal flycatcher and its allies were actually most closely related to the sharpbill, a species that had itself long confounded taxonomists due to its unusual morphology relative to other suboceans. Together, these species were also sometimes found to be most closely related to the Titires and Bacards in Titiridae. But because the sharpbill and the royal flycatchers have consistently been found to be each other's closest relative, some taxonomists, including earlier versions of the Clements checklist, have grouped these into a single family and expanded Oxyrhynchidae. However, given the relative age of the split between the sharpbill and the other flycatcher species, and the morphological and behavioral distinctiveness of the sharpbill, we now follow other taxonomic authorities in treating these as separate families. Erythrocercidae, so this is a small family of 3 species in a single genus, Erythrocercus. They have also had a somewhat complicated taxonomic history. They were long placed with other flycatchers in the family Monarchidae, but molecular phylogenetic studies instead found that these 3 species were instead more closely related to a group of mostly warbler-like birds that were distributed in Africa and Asia. So in these studies, the Erythrocircus flycatchers have consistently been found to be sister to the warbler-like birds in the family Scotorcercidae, which includes, among others, the scrub warbler, the setio warblers, the bush warblers in Horornis, and the tessias. Because Erythrocircus have consistently been found as sister to this group, some taxonomic authorities, again, like previous versions of the Clements checklist, had chosen to include them in an expanded Scotorcercidae. However, due to the relatively deep divergence of this group and their morphological and ecological distinctiveness, we have now chosen to recognize them as a separate family. The last family split is the Salpornithidae. The spotted creeper is just 2 species in the genus Salpornis. They too have had a surprisingly complicated taxonomic history and have at times been considered part of either the family Certhiidae, with representative pictured on the right, and at other times even considered part of Psittaceae, or the nuthatches. And while I certainly do recall a large tree creeper, genetic evidence is not always consistently found that they're closely related. In this comprehensive phylogeny of songbirds using genomic data, the spotted creepers and tree creepers were found to be each other's closest relative, but because of the relatively deep divergence between the two and uncertainty from other studies that did not recover this sister relationship, it was decided that these 2 groups were best treated as separate families. So in addition to the newly recognized families on the Clements checklist, there were also many changes made to genera, from recognizing new genera to shuffling species to different genera, and even getting rid of some genera. But none of these changes were perhaps as large and impactful to a global birding audience than the breakup of the hawk genus Accipiter. The genus Accipiter was, until October of this year, the largest genus of hawks, and despite their variability, did share some general features that made them seem like a very natural group, including relatively long, narrow tails and relatively broad wings. However, like so many things, genetic studies have painted a different picture of the former genus Accipiter. In this comprehensive phylogenetic study, using genetic data, we can see that the reasons for making these changes are multifold. The traditional genus Accipiter is not monophyletic and is broken apart mainly by the harriers in the genus Circus, but also by some smaller genera, including Erythrotriorchis. So based on the rules of monophily in taxonomy and classification, change was needed. To correct this, 2 approaches were possible. The one we adopted, where Accipiter was broken up into multiple genera, including Oster, Tachyspiza, and Aerospiza. Or another option would be merging the Circus, harriers, and some of these other smaller genera into an expanded Accipiter. However, that approach was not taken because of the highly distinctive nature of the genus Circus, as well as the deep genetic divergence of these groups. Because of the nature of the phylogeny, breaking up Accipiter required recognition of multiple new genera, with those noted, some of those noted here. So from our starting slide, where I displayed some pictures of some fun former Accipiters, we now have the 2 birds on the left in the genus Tachyspiza, the 2 birds in the middle representing what's left of Accipiter. Only 6 species remain in that genus from a high of 46. And on the right, the Cooper's hawk and northern goshawk, or American goshawk, and Eurasian goshawk, those now move to the genus Oster. And then we retain the genus Circus with 16 species. So I know everyone generally hates linear sequence changes, and they are frustrating, since in addition to learning all the new names of the various new taxa, we now have to learn where on our eBird checklist the new species even are. But having an accurate linear sequence is an important part of taxonomy and classification. because it is ultimately how we represent the relationships we're trying to describe in our taxonomic system. How we arrive at that new linear sequence follows some important but simple rules. Just like the rest of taxonomy, the linear sequence ultimately follows the rules of monophyly, where species are arranged from the least diverse to the most diverse clade. So each time a phylogeny branches, we look at the two resulting clades and we count the number of species, with the least diverse clade coming first in the linear sequence. This is applied for sequencing from everything to orders all the way down to species and subspecies, so that once we determine the least diverse clade, we then look at any clade within that to see how it branches and continue the process until we have our final sequence. If two clades have the same number of species, then the taxa are arranged linearly by range, with taxa being arranged from northwest to southeast. And those are kind of the two big rules. So if we take this example phylogeny, we can work through the branches and organize them from the most diverse to the least diverse clades. And each time we hit a new clade, we can then break that into successively smaller clades until we arrive at our final linear sequence. So in this example, we're assuming that within a clade, species are already arranged from northwest to southeast, just for simplicity. So if we start working through this phylogeny, our first two clades are the green and white clades. And because the green clade contains fewer species, that comes first. Then within the white clade, our next split shows one species, sister to the rest. So species H comes next. At the next level in, we have two clades with the yellow and blue. The yellow clade contains only 3 species, and the blue 4, so we start with the yellow, where we have species G, sister to species E and F. And then in the blue clade, we have 2 evenly numbered groups, and so we simply arrange that by geography to arrive at our final linear sequence. And so we can do this, we can apply this to how the sequence of the new hawk genera fall out. All of these species in this phylogeny were considered closely related, and so always appeared somewhat close to each other in the linear sequence on our checklist. However, due to the former size of the genus Accipiter, the species in that genus were always listed last. But now if we work through this group branch by branch using our new taxonomy, we get a very different linear sequence where we ultimately end up having the harriers in the genus Circus as the last in this linear sequence. And then to wrap things up, I'm just going to introduce some hybrids, and then Marshall will take over. So I love hybrids. Hybrids are the best. They're super fun to find in the field because they're always a fun puzzle to figure out. But biologically, they're also really fascinating. Hybridization in birds is actually rather common, with 10% of all bird species estimated to hybridize. And while some might be one-off events, like some of the cool birds that Marshall's going to show us, others are much more frequent, and understanding what happens when these species do hybridize is fascinating and is something that I studied for my PhD and in my postdoc. In studying hybridization in birds, one of the most important things to know is the frequency of hybridization and where hybrids occur on the landscape. Just by knowing these two things, we can learn a lot about the fitness of hybrids, what factors may be contributing to hybridization, and whether hybridization is changing over time. But even documenting and tracking the rare one-off instances of hybridization in eBird is extremely important, as they could be indicative of range changes or differences in how species are interacting. And ultimately, this will have a lasting impact on how we understand how and when hybridization occurs between species. For example, eBird observations of hybrids between pied and black stilt, which is critically endangered in New Zealand, observations in eBird could help conservation workers understand patterns and frequencies of hybridization and help them develop strategies to better protect the black stilt. So hybrids in eBird are really important, and Marshall's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Marshall, yeah, I think your volume's off there.
Yep. Yeah, so I would add that I also love hybrids and that I think they're really fun. And this is another case where sort of eBird's informal taxonomy can help move us forward scientifically, as Shawn was alluding to. Adding a hybrid to eBird is sort of a, this informal process. We add them once it really seems like there's good evidence that hybrid is occurring, but that does not mean we have like full sequence DNA that identifies both parents for every single example. So each year with the taxonomy update, there are fun new ones that you can see and explore in eBird for the first time. Prior to adding these tend to be buried under like duck spa or shorebird spa or something. So I'm going to start at the bottom left. And if you're struggling to decide if that looks more like a buff-breasted or a Baird sandpiper, that's what we think it is, half buff-breasted, half Bairds. There's been a couple examples of this hybrid, but we just added it this year, and this is an example that's in the database now of that. The one on the right, I find really fun because bottom right, I love New World warblers. And this one sort of looks like a yellow-throated warbler, but it sort of has the back color of a pine warbler. And it turns out that it seems like this is the first instance we know of pine crossed with a yellow-throated warbler. And there's some cool sets of images from 2 days from this really one-off single observation of this combination. I'll just say as a side, every year people are finding new world warblers hybrid combinations, and it is just really fun to see how modern photography is helping turn these like, wonder what that weird bird is, into like, oh, that seems to be a new, never before seen hybrid. So it's the levels of documentation that we have now are sort of have us in this great hybrid understanding of hybridization renaissance, I would say. Really cool one on the top right. That's a common loon crossed with a yellow-billed loon. There's just a couple examples of that in our database now, plus an older record or two. But really, really fun to see that sort of bill shape and bill color coming through on a loon. Those two look pretty similar in the field, but really differ mostly in the bill color. And this one is like perfectly intermediate there. At top left, we have golden eyes crossed with bufflehead. The top left one has actually been available in eBird for quite a while and has a number of records. So that one's common golden eye crossed with a bufflehead and sort of produces this odd pattern on the face. You can see the green gloss to the head, which is coming from the common golden eye. You can see the sort of scapulars have extensive white, which is typical of common golden eye. So that's a really cool looking bird. The one we added this year is Barrows crossed with bufflehead, Barrows golden eye crossed with bufflehead. And in addition to the purple on the head and the extra black on the scapulars, you actually can see the sort of face pattern of Barrows golden eye showing up in that a little bit of a crescent in front of the eye with a pointy top versus the rounded top in the other bird. So it's just really neat to see how the hybrid characters come through and do sort of consistently give you hints for what the parent is. And then one more duck is below that. That's a female gadwall swimming on the left, but then the duck swimming to its right is a black-bellied whistling duck crossed with a white-faced whistling duck. Couple examples of that one. They tend to occur in sort of places where the white-faced whistling ducks are escapees and black-bellieds are native, even though these two do overlap in their common range. One thing that often does seem to happen with hybrids is where one species shows up out of range. That's often can be the impetus for these one-off hybrid events, and areas where they overlap extensively, often they have a better mate choice. And that may be why we've seen white-faced crossed with black-bellied whistling duck, where one of them is essentially a vagrant or an escapee, versus in the places where both of them are common. So as I talked about, Pam hinted at the herring gull split, and I talked a little bit about how we move records around. Here's a couple real challenges that were presented with the herring gull split. At the top row here is what formerly was just glaucus x herring gull, but now that herring gull's been all split up, Top right is glaucus crossed with American herring gull. Top left is glaucus presumably crossed with Vega gull, and the middle one is glaucus crossed with European herring gull. All these identifications are presumed based on range, but one of the things that is really, really neat here is, as I was poking around in the images from Europe, most of those glaucus with European herring gull hybrids have entirely dark bills, whereas the ones I'm used to seeing in the United States almost always have sort of the extensively pale-based bill in the first winter that the glaucus gull do. So pretty cool to see a difference like that popping out in the hybrids. The two at the bottom left and bottom right, I don't know how you could even guess to tell them apart, but the right one is a lesser blackback crossed with a presumably American herring gull, and the left one is from Europe and presumably crossed with a European herring gull. So those records have been subdivided based on sort of presumed range, but there's a lot of presumptions going on there. And then the final thing I would close on is just the notion of undescribed species in eBird. Pam highlighted the Timor nightjar just a year ago in this webinar. We were talking about it as an example for one of these undescribed forms. And in the year since, it has been formally described and now sort of moved up the ranks in eBird so that it counts on people's life lists. But the fact that we have these undescribed forms available in eBird, they're often very well known by the guides in South America or Indonesia that there is this new taxon that is yet to be described. But that lets us collect observations, start to understand the range and movements of these birds, collect vocalizations, collect photos, and those vocalizations and photos can then be used to help make the case for its species level status and what it's related to. So I just threw up here on the right some of the new ones from this year. There's 3 new ones: a barbet, a laughing thrush, and a flower pecker from the Moretus mountains of sort of southwestern Borneo. That's been an area with some new discoveries recently. And then the Obi Mizamala is the one I'll sort of highlight at the end as one that we just added this year, but it's been there for a while. It's been sort of confused with the Bakan Mizamala, just a little bit to the north. Looks similar, but is different enough that we expect that will prove to be a new species, maybe in next year's update or maybe one that follows. And then just closing image is brown and Cocos boobies were split. This is the one example from the Caribbean that shows both of them with brown on the right and Cocos on the left. So just another really cool example of sort of the new world we're living in, with new birds to look for in new out of the way places and new ways to understand these ones. And I think one of the outstanding questions for Shawn and other taxonomists to look into is, is there another split needed in brown booby with Central Pacific ones and the nominate ones elsewhere? So anyway, lots more to come in the future in bird taxonomy, I think.